Andrew Urquhart with you on the program today. And hey, I get it. There's the Olympics on at the moment, and for a lot of people, it's have we won any golds overnight? And that seems to be the dominant focus of the news cycle when they're not talking about US politics. However, very serious things happening in the Middle East at the moment with, a potential escalation in hostilities between Israel and Iran, with some assassinations and, certainly some fighting words have gone back and forth, and it is potentially the case that we're on the brink of a very serious situation in the Middle East. Joining us on the program now is a geopolitical analyst for the Democracy Project, Geoffrey Miller. Geoffrey, kia ora. Good morning.
Good morning, Andrew.
This is a very serious situation. For those who have been busy watching the Kiwis win gold in Paris, give us a little bit of an update. What has caused the tensions to rise in the Middle East recently?
Right. Well, just over a week ago, Israel assassinated the political leader of Hamas, a man called Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. He's normally based in Doha, in Qatar, in the Gulf. But he was visiting Tehran for the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian. And so he was there staying in a guest house of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the Israelis had planted a bomb there sometime before he was due to stay in that guest house, and they exploded that bomb while Haniyeh was in the guest house. So it doesn't get much bigger than that, because he was the main political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, the main political leader of Hamas. He was the one dealing with the negotiations over a ceasefire with Israel and the mediators of Qatar, Egypt, and all of these ceasefire talks were really being coordinated by Haniyeh. And he was seen as the pragmatic leader of Hamas. And I think you have to be realistic here. Pragmatic in Hamas terms perhaps is a bit different from pragmatic in New Zealand terms, but nevertheless he was the face of Hamas that you could talk to. The military leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, who's based in Gaza, he's leading this campaign. He was the one who orchestrated the attacks on October the 7th, and now Hamas has instilled him as the successor to Ismail Haniyeh, and he's certainly not pragmatic. He is keen to really keep fighting Israel for as long as it takes, really, and is much more hardline. But that is now who the West and who Israel is going to have to deal with, because he is now the political leader of Hamas as well.
And if anything, so he's likely to be he's likely to be more hardline. And the person that peace talks were being negotiated with has just been assassinated by one of the negotiating parties. I mean, this is pretty volatile. But also, if that were not bad enough, also to the north, to Lebanon, tensions in that part of the world as well.
Exactly. So look, we've been waiting for more than a week for a response from Iran to this assassination on its soil of the leader of Hamas. And Hamas is a closer Iranian client. And then on top of all of that, just shortly before Ismail Haniyeh was killed just over a week ago, a top Hezbollah commander, Fuad Shukur, was killed in Lebanon. So Hezbollah, another group that is very much allied with Iran, a proxy of Iran in Lebanon, and that was also a huge moment. So we're in this holding pattern at the moment, Andrew, where we're waiting effectively for the full response of Hezbollah in the north, of Hamas in Gaza, and of Iran itself to these killings that we've seen over the past 10 days. And it feels a bit like a calm before the storm. Yep. Every day there are sort of new reports and signals as to what is actually being planned, and it is kind of ominous. You could say it's good news that there hasn't been a response just yet, and it would be nice to think that Iran has decided to turn the other cheek and to not escalate this further. because that would be a good thing in my book.
Yep.
If we didn't see a further escalation, and in some ways it could be seen as a trap. Responding to this could lead then to an even more devastating Israeli response, and in the end, Israel is backed by the United States in terms of weaponry. Iran is probably going to come off worse of any full-scale wider regional war. It would be nice to think that Iran is thinking better of all of this, but I tend to think that actually something bigger is in the works involving Iran, involving Russia. Russia and Iran are close allies, and that we may see an even bigger escalation than perhaps some fear. I hope that doesn't happen, but the longer this sort of uneasy pause goes on, the more I think that perhaps something bigger is being cooked up.
There have been some, certainly between Israel and Lebanon, there's been, drone strikes back and forth, but certainly not the level of retaliation which is anticipated. Of course, the last time there was an assassination on Iranian soil by Israeli forces, there was a missile attack on Israel, which was, well, for the most part unsuccessful. The so-called Iron Dome shot down pretty much all of the missiles. What sort of options does Iran have, given that their last retaliation, as it were, was more of a symbolic exercise than a military one?
That's right. Back in April, we saw a tit-for-tat exchange of missiles and drone attacks between Israel and Iran. And that was quite choreographed, to use the language that is used by those in the military. And so, in other words, it was predictable, and Israel was able to defend itself against those missiles. They had a lot of warning. Jordan also helped with that, and because the missiles have to travel across Jordanian airspace. The worry this time is that it will be something much more overwhelming. Iron Dome is a wonderful invention, and it is very, very powerful, but it is not perfect, and it can be overwhelmed. It has been in the past. There are gaps. We saw an attack, a drone strike by the Houthis based in Yemen. We haven't even mentioned them just a few weeks ago on Tel Aviv in Israel, and that missile got through the Iron Dome. The drone strike and killed an Israeli civilian. So, things can happen, and it is crystal ball gazing in a sense as to exactly what will transpire. It was very, very unhelpful, this assassination by Israel of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. He was the man, Ismail Haniyeh was the man you could talk to, the pragmatic face of Hamas, as I said, and he was the one that you needed to try and get about a ceasefire. And look, this war in Gaza has gone on now for 9 months. We're getting up towards the 1 year mark. 40,000 Palestinians now have been killed, the vast majority of those civilians, women and children. It is horrific. Every day we kind of become immune to the headlines, but just overnight there were another 40 people in Gaza who were killed by Israeli strikes. So that war grinds on. The death toll keeps going up. We desperately need a ceasefire. There's a humanitarian catastrophe still unfolding in Gaza. It's dire, the situation.
This is the part that I lose sight of that. Sorry to interrupt, Jeffrey. This is the part that I don't understand. That it would seem that the Gaza conflict coming to an end, that just about every part of Gaza has been invaded and occupied by Israeli forces. They have certainly blown up most of the significant strongholds in that part of the world. You would think that if there was going to be an end game for Gaza, we were nearly there, and perhaps a ceasefire and release of prisoners, Netanyahu could look like the savior hero and secure his political role within Israel. For Israel to take purposeful steps to make the situation even more volatile, just when it looks like Gaza could come to a somewhat messy end, what politically would motivate that move, in your opinion?
Well, look, if you look at Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, I don't think his calculations are the same as everyone else's calculations. He has an incentive for the war to go on as long as possible, because the day the war ends, the day his career ends, essentially. And he's going to be in a whole world of trouble. really, politically and in terms of the legal processes that are running against him in the background. So he has every incentive to escalate this further, and he's in a very right-wing coalition with quite extreme politicians who also want to continue this vengeance against Hamas, and they will not rest until they see every trace of Hamas is obliterated in Gaza. The problem, as I see it, is that's impossible to do because this war is creating a new generation of supporters of Hamas and of Hamas fighters because of the destruction in Gaza. If your whole family has been killed, you probably want to join Hamas too in Gaza at the moment. That's just the reality of it all. So I don't think you can eradicate Hamas militarily. I think we can only solve this conflict through a political solution. There is no military solution to a political problem. We should have learned that after 9/11, or the United States and Israel should have seen that after 9/11. You cannot solve terrorism simply militarily. We've seen that in Afghanistan. We've seen that movie before. And sadly, it's happening again in Gaza. It is sad to watch, and it is heartbreaking when you see some of the images that are coming out of Gaza.
In terms of New Zealand's role, now, little country at the bottom of the South Pacific, and as you mentioned, the superpowers involved with this, and potentially that's likely to ratchet up in terms of world involvement. New Zealand, with almost no military apart from the 6 that we sent to the Gulf states, no military involvement in the area. What can New Zealand's role be, perhaps at a geopolitical or a diplomatic level, to aid in what's potentially going to happen in the Middle East, Jeffrey?
I think New Zealand can play a small but significant role in this conflict in terms of trying to dial down the temperature. New Zealand has actually a good reputation throughout most of the Middle East. We are seen as a reasonable, pragmatic voice. And I think New Zealand's independent foreign policy that New Zealand has pursued for the last 30, 40 years stands in good stead for that kind of role. I think it is at the diplomatic, on the diplomatic side of things that New Zealand can make a difference. So in my view, the New Zealand Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, he should be travelling to the Middle East simply as a fact-finding mission initially, going to the Gulf states, touring some of the Middle East, the parts of the Middle East that are able to be visited at the moment, because a lot of it is off limits, let's face it. But simply getting a picture of what is going on the ground and what can New Zealand do to help. You know, there are players like Qatar, Egypt, that are involved in the ceasefire negotiations. A Western country like New Zealand, what could it do to contribute towards those discussions? Is there anything, inviting figures to New Zealand for negotiations, or hold a retreat here, or some kind of summit at any level? Could that be an option that could be explored? Could Winston Peters be involved? He is an experienced foreign minister. He's held the job now 3 times under 3 different governments. So there are opportunities here, but you haven't really seen New Zealand go beyond issuing statements. Winston Peters, Christopher Luxon, they've issued many, many statements. They're very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East, and they talk about it a lot. Winston Peters has referred to it several times as an utter catastrophe in Gaza, and he's called many times now for a ceasefire. But I just think that New Zealand needs to go beyond calling for things and expecting others to do the work, and to actually play a slightly more active role here. Winston Peters, he likes traveling. He likes going abroad. He's away in the Pacific again just at the moment. He left last night. I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect him to head to the likes of the Gulf states and just to do a speaking and listening tour, really, first and foremost, as the first step to working out what New Zealand could do, if anything, here. New Zealand is certainly not going to bring peace to the Middle East on its own, but I don't think that means that New Zealand can't play its part in all of this. You know, New Zealand is part of the picture here. New Zealand does have skin in the game with those 6 troops assigned to the anti-Houthi mission in the Gulf. So we do have a real interest in solving conflict in the Middle East, because in the end, war is terrible for business, and New Zealand is a small trading nation. It relies on global stability. So I think New Zealand has very much a vested interest in solving all of this.
As you say, Mr. Peters enjoys travelling. Significant, though, despite all of the travel he's done, very little of it to the Middle East, more of an Asia-Pacific focus, which I suppose makes sense geopolitically for New Zealand?
Indeed. Look, Winston Peters, I think, is continuing the Pacific reset that he started back when he was foreign minister under the Labour government's first term back from 2017 to 2020. And he's continuing with that approach, and he's made it his goal to visit all 17 other members of the Pacific Islands Forum this year. So he's visiting four countries in the Pacific this week, particularly in Micronesia and parts of the Pacific that New Zealand foreign ministers don't get to very often.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is beyond him. I think Winston Peters, would be actually ideally suited in many ways to doing some of this kind of thing. He's very comfortable in all kinds of settings, and we're seeing that in how he goes around the Pacific. He talks to Pacific leaders, then he goes to Washington. Yeah. He's very comfortable in all diplomatic settings. I think it would be ideal for him, and I think he could fit this into his schedule. He does like traveling. He's been to Turkey, he's been to Egypt briefly on both of those occasions in the Middle East. So he has been before during this term, but just for short periods of time. I think a wider, more dedicated Middle East trip would be something definitely to be considered up there in Wellington.
Well, look, this is a complex and volatile situation, and it may change within hours. Jeffrey, thank you so much for the work that you do and for the analysis that you brought this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.